Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Someone was asking me the other day in an interview, did I think we could ever solve this thing? And I said, well, there were probably people sitting in the pre-Civil War times sitting there saying, well, we'll never solve this. It's impossible. And we go to war over it. And yet, today, we do have general agreement on the divisive issue of that time.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father Robert Kirtland, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections is the abortion debate, avoiding slogans. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Well, Bob, I'd like to talk a little bit about the recent Supreme Court decision, often known as the Webster case these days, and to see what some of the ramifications of that are. Perhaps we should look at a little bit of that background that's connected with all of that. We go back to the Roe v. Wade case, Supreme Court decision of January 22nd, 1973. That was a 7-2 decision, by the way, a wider margin than we had in the recent case. And it really decided on the basis of the right to privacy, which was founded in the 14th Amendment, that says that a woman had the right to terminate a pregnancy. And that's the law of the land, what we've been living with, and now we've got this Webster case. Why don't we just go back to Roe v. Wade for a minute and see if there's anything else we want to say about that by way of background. Do you want to comment on that?
The Roe v. Wade was simply an extension, as you say, of that rather nebulous concept of a penumbra of privacy that was caught up in the guarantees of freedom in the Constitution and passed on then to the states and to all governmental authorities, not just the federal government, through the 14th Amendment. But it's a concept that the court discovered only really in recent years in a variety of applications. It was one that was very much opposed by the great Justice Frankfurter for many years. It came into prominence with the Griswold case many years before that, which had struck down a Connecticut law limiting access to birth control information and materials. And it was done on the idea that the government had no business constructively getting into people's bedrooms and so on. Well, this was a natural extension enough of the idea of privacy. I think it's also apparent that the court at that time was very libertarian. The court at the time of Roe v. Wade was very libertarian, and there wasn't much of a conservative voice. I also think it's apparent that not only because of the decision itself, which is perhaps not the most clearly reasoned statement of the court in modern times, but also because of subsequent statements that that Justice Blackmun, who wrote the decision of the court in that abortion case, he very much believes in abortion as a value that he believes should be guaranteed to women, and so that he was finding a means to enshrine that deep conviction of his in American constitutional law through the
He's the one that wrote the majority position.
That's right. Yeah, yes. He wrote the decision of the court.
Yes, right.
That's right.
So that gives us a little bit of background. So that 14th Amendment what we were talking about is the one that said the states had the obligation not to take life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now that doesn't say anything about this right to privacy, but I take it that they built their argument out of that, what the 14th Amendment had to say.
That's right. The 14th Amendment is just a channel by which really the provisions of the Bill of Rights generally have come to be applied to the individual states. In the original concept, the Bill of Rights applied only to the federal action, and the 14th Amendment was taken as a conduit by which to impose upon the states the same obligations that the federal government had with regard to the rights of individual citizens, and so that it comes into that business of freedom from unreasonable search and seizure kind of thing.
And so it boiled down to saying that women had a right, as the common saying is, sort of over their own bodies, or to deal with their own personhood in this way, and so that it was extended to say that the states could not restrict that right.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, what it said was not that women had this right. That was the implication, because what it said was that the state may not interfere with the exercise of this.
That's the main point, that the states could not do that. And
that's
therefore the implication is, and the common catchphrase has been, women have a right over their own bodies.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so that gives us some sense of Roe v. Wade and what we were dealing with. And now we have the recent decision, the becoming known as the Webster case, much longer title.
Yeah, presumably it'll be Webster, yeah.
Yes, So now let's take a look at what that has done. It really was dealing with a law in the state of Missouri, right?
That's right. Or a law with a number of restrictions on the use of public funds and public institutions, hospitals supported by public funds and so on, to give counseling with regard to abortion, to encourage it, or to perform abortions. And once again, it was directed at state action, and it did indeed reverse a trend that the court had been following until now, which was to strike down any state limitations at all upon abortion that seemed to violate the rather narrow reading of the strictures in Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade said that the state could not interfere with the decision to have an abortion during the first trimester. It could lay down some considerations for the health and welfare of the mother in the second trimester, and in the third it could limit the access to abortion very severely if, in the judgment of the state legislature, that was important for the life of the mother.
One thing that's happened now is that the trimester idea is not built into the Webster case.
That's right. It's thrown out now.
Right.
And of course that was a good thing, because to talk about viability is a moving point. One of the aspects of viability, as I understand what the doctors are saying, is that is in part at least a statement of the state of the art at any given time, and the ability of medical institutions, healthcare institutions, to preserve the health and life of a newborn infant. And certainly that thing has over the years been pushed back, probably as far, I guess, from what the physiologists say, as it now can be. Although I think that some of the people who are doing research in this area talk of the idea of the possibility of a totally artificial womb. I don't know at all, and that's something the scientists have to answer.
I heard some of the doctors saying that they thought that the current Webster case was really not in touch with current medical practice, and even said that it contained some foolishness. I think it was in relationship to the age of viability and the lung capacity of the fetus.
Yeah.
And they were talking about 20 weeks or so, and the way I understood, the doctors were saying, well, they didn't see how that was possible according to the current practices.
Well,
current understanding of the viability of the fetus.
I think there are many doctors who don't like anybody who's not a doctor looking over their shoulders. I mean, they're unusual in that most of us enjoy having people looking at us from outside and criticizing what we do, but doctors are an exception to that rule.
Yeah, we're going to list priests,
that's
right?
That's right.
Bob,
Priests
we're really open to criticism, right?
And of course, you'd like to have somebody come into your class when you're teaching and suggest how you should and shouldn't be doing this. Yeah, but I think that I think that those statements are exaggerated, as I understand it, and I haven't read the decision. It, of course, just came out Monday, and I haven't seen the advanced sheets on it yet. But I think that it left the decision of a child who was at least 20 weeks gestation, or a fetus of at least 20 weeks gestation. They left it to the discretion of the physician, and that if, in the physician's judgment, there was a prospect that the child would be born viable, that he was to do the testing, but it was his judgment, as I understand it. Now, once again, we have to look at what the court says. But the court isn't telling doctors exactly how to practice medicine. I think the point behind that, in the state legislation, which the court was reviewing for constitutionality, the idea might very well have been instead to insist that the doctor must regard the fetus as a patient as well as the mother.
And that really is a change, isn't it? I mean, from the kind of viewpoint. Well, there is something in Roe v. Wade, though, isn't there, that the states do have an interest in potential human life, I think is the phrase that they use. The state has a legitimate interest in that. I recall that phrase probably in one of the opinions written.
Yeah, as I recall, that I think was something that had to do with that third trimester limitation of access to abortion.
Would lead to that, of saying yes, the states could regulate during the third trimester.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Bob, what's going to happen with all of this now is that we're going to get this moved to the state level, aren't we? I mean, this is the various states now are going to be considering legislation. People are going to be introducing legislation from both sides of this debate, and some will be trying to restrict the availability of abortions within the state, and we're going to get a battle within the state legislatures. We're going to get a battle over the election of state legislators in the future. And I would say one potentially good thing about all of that is that the debate can get carried on. In other words, we're going to be forced to look at it again. We can't just sit back and say, well, the Supreme Court has said this or that, but it will promote more discussion at a local level. Now, probably a lot of that is going to be heated discussion, and we're going to get a lot of polarized debate. But at least somewhere in the midst of all this, there has to be some potential to get some honest and open discussion going on this most difficult and trying question here.
Oh, I think that's perfectly true. As a matter of fact, I think that's a very real value. You have to remember, of course, that it was the Supreme Court that took it out of the political forum and out of state political debate, 16 years ago.
That's right. You know, I was thinking of Judge Bork, who's been on television a lot lately because he almost was on the Supreme Court or was up for it, and he gets interviewed all the time. And I notice he has a theme that comes out over and over, that we got to return the court to being a legal institution and not a political institution.
Or an instrument of social agency,
No. That seems to be a major point. He said that he would have been on Justice Scalia's side. Out of all the opinions that were given, he said it was Scalia's that he would be most in tune with. And the way I took it was Scalia had said that the court really should have just gone right straight forward and overturned Roe v. Wade.
That's right, yeah, and that's an interesting thing. But getting back to your point about the public debate about it, since the court preempted the political process in Roe versus Wade, the debate has been academic, and therefore we haven't had debate nearly so much as simply the tiresome and repeated reiteration of extreme positions from one end of the spectrum and the other, and that's hardly been a debate. So that, as you say, the fact that this is tossed back into the political arena means, I think, that we have the opportunity for a serious debate, so that citizens who now are going to have some voice in what kind of decision is going to result will have to and have the opportunity to do some thinking and to listen to some thinking about the thing, which was a waste of the average citizen's time before, because if the court was going to take the decision over, the average citizen didn't have anything to say about it.
That's really a good point. It really set a mood, didn't it, in the country? And the other thing it did then, I suppose, that it let something simmer for 16 years, and now we're going to see it bursting out all over the place.
Oh, yeah, and it's an excruciating issue, as we know.
Let's get that out front. I mean, you know, it is the most divisive issue we've had for probably in memory since Prohibition debate, and maybe even having to go back to the slavery question.
Yes.
I know someone was asking me the other day in an interview, did I think we could ever solve this thing? And I said, well, there were probably people sitting in the pre-Civil War times sitting there saying, well, you know, we'll never solve this. It's impossible. And we go to war over it. And yet, today, we do have general agreement on the divisive issue of that time.
That's right.
And so it gives you a sort of larger historical perspective to say, yeah, a lot of times you can make surprising progress. There were people who said that issue could never possibly be solved, and yet today the issue of slavery is a non-issue in the United States.
And then, of course, the obvious parallel is that Justice Taney decided when the Dred Scott case came along that the Supreme Court could solve the problem, the debate for the nation on slavery, because the court's original position from the the Conference of the Judges was that they would simply refuse to hear the case. They would refer back to an earlier case, Strawder versus Graham, in which the issue was precisely the same as in Dred Scott. But Taney, the poor man, thought that he could write an opinion that would clarify the issue and settle the debate for the nation on the slavery issue. And it's another one of those instances where the court's taking on an issue that was not ripe for resolution was making a terrible mistake. The only thing that's scary about that is to remember that the consequence of that debate was the Civil War.
Yes.
And that's pretty frightening. But getting back to this thing...
We're probably not going to have a Civil War, but we are going to have a very inflammatory debate going on.
Well, we're getting a lot of violence, and I think that is one of the most discouraging things about it. But one of the oddities in Justice Blackmun's dissent in the Webster case that's just come down is that he says now the door is open to violent political debate, precisely the thing we're talking about. And an editorial in the Wall Street Journal this morning said it's too bad he didn't think of that in 1973, because he was the one that set off the polarizing falling out of the two sides on an issue which was not ripe for resolution.
So, Bob, what we're going to have to do now, or what we need to push for, it seems to me, is some sort of rational debate on the question. And
Yes.
There's been a man, Father Richard McCormick, Jesuit theologian, who has his own bias, as everyone does on this question, has written an article in which he talked about 10 rules for debating the question. And we might just look at some of those
Sure.
and discuss them a bit about how they're going to help. And I noticed that one of those that he uses is you've already referred to, and that is avoid the use of slogans, because the slogans just get in the way. And he gives very definite examples of all of this. He says, first of all, the pro-life people should not walk around describing abortion as murder. He says that's an inflammatory slogan, and that it's a value-laden term, he says. That means a morally unjustifiable killing of another person. And he claims that it's not necessary to defend the rights of the fetus or what he considers the Catholic position by the use of that language. So he thinks that we don't get any place that way. Now, if you listen on television and you see the sloganeering and you hear that a lot, and that's on a lot of the placards that's used. Now, there might be a debatable kind of point, but McCormick's suggesting that we not use that word murder to describe what is happening to the fetus.
Yeah, I think that's important. In fact, that brings up one more thing about the court I'd like to talk about a bit before we get into that, and that is that murder is a crime, and a crime is an artificial quantum. A crime is an act committed in violation of a statute. And so that's why we have a trial of somebody who's obviously shot his next-door neighbor. We've seen it happen on television. We know that A shoots B, but we still say he's a suspect and he's not guilty until a trial establishes that. So the crime is an artificial quantum, and a murder is a crime. And therefore, precisely as the court came along and said that there was nothing wrong with abortion, then it took away the notion of crime and of murder from the idea of abortion. And that just leads me to say that I'm not sure that the court itself has been entirely clear in pointing out that there are legal questions and ethical questions here, and we live in a time when, unfortunately, the court sets a current going that something is ethically okay if it says it's legally okay. We've tended to equate those two things, and I think that's one of the most pernicious kinds of mistakes that could flow out of this whole thing. That's one of the things that I think was kind of bad about Roe versus Wade. It kind of made all kinds of people say, I would never have an abortion, I would never approve of having an abortion personally, but it's okay for somebody else to do it.
Yeah, that is also one of McCormick's principles. He says we must distinguish morality and public policy. That you cannot simply equate those two. Now, sometimes they can go together. I mean, a moral position can be enshrined in some sort of public policy,
like not beating up little kids or spouses or things like that.
But there's also times when there's a differentiation between the two.
Oh,
and
yes.
One has to be aware of that.
And it's tremendously important to keep those things apart in both directions, both that law not be corrupted into becoming an instrument of moral convictions on the one hand, because the business of law and the business of government is not totalitarian. It doesn't cover the whole span of life. It covers a narrow but important segment of the life of a society, which is to say the public order.
So it can get as simple as this. If something is allowed legally, then people say then it must be morally all right to do.
It must be okay without drawing that distinction. That's right.
It must be morally okay. I mean, that's sort of the conclusion. And that really is a false sort of identification, and I think it needs to be cut through, and we have to make a distinction.
It can only muddy our thinking about law and ethics and morality if we allow it to go unnoticed.
Let's go back to another slogan here, Bob, that McCormick says that we should beware of, and that is the phrase, "A woman has a right to her own body."
Yes.
This simply assumes that the fetus is part of the woman's body, which, is not a total statement, I don't think, about fetal life. And it sort of makes the implication that a woman rights over her own body are absolute in some sense. I mean, what that factors out from a religious viewpoint is God and how we relate to God, and that God is the author of life, and that there's some sort of respect, that fundamental respect is due there. But he sees that as another slogan that really doesn't get us any place.
It doesn't move the debate along in any clear fashion. All that's right. The difficulty with that, and the people who tried to draw all kinds of parallels, is the fact that pregnancy is an absolutely unique human phenomenon. I mean, we don't have anything that is exactly the parallel. Being in the same rocket ship or the same lifeboat or whatever is not precisely the same thing, and so that for the notion that the fetus is simply a part of the woman's body, it's an appendage like a wart or something of that sort that one may choose to excise, certainly does not clarify why the whole issue of abortion is so painful.
Right. So one of the first things, if we're going to carry on a rational debate, now that this is moving back to states, we ought to try to avoid the slogans on one side of saying, talking about murderers and murder, and the other side just simply saying a woman has a right to her own body.
Eric Voegelin always used to say that slogans were intellectual terrorism, that you would be making a point and somebody would come along and say in very absolute tones, a woman has a right to her own body, or abortion is murder, and it was supposed to intimidate you into shutting up.
Yes, well, that's a good point to keep in mind. Now let's take up a second one here that McCormick says about these rules for debate, if we're going to do this better. He talks about...
I'll let you get through those rules, Jim.
Well, we're not going to get through all of them, Bob. We don't need to, but they are helpful, I think, to get us what we're after here is how we're going to deal with this question now in such a troubled issue. Another one he says is attempt to identify areas of agreement instead of just starting out what we don't agree on. So, and he makes some stabs at that. He says we could all say that abortion in most cases is tragic and an undesirable thing. I mean, as simple as that abortion is tragic. I noticed there was a news program the other night, and that was sort of a tagline, that people disagreed, but the one thing they seemed to agree on was that abortion is a tragic thing, and usually undesirable. I think that's important to realize here, for pro-life people to realize, I think, that the other side isn't simply saying, whoopee, let's have more abortions.
Yeah, I'm going to get pregnant so I can have an abortion.
Yeah,
I mean,
we got to see it. Yeah, it's not a happy event. It's an undesirable thing. There's a tragedy about it, and of course I think you ought to get that said early on. And I can tell what happens is on the side of the pro-choice movement, I mean, they don't want to say that because it seems in one way to weaken their position. Same way the pro-life people very often have to be careful of things. They won't concede certain elements because it's going to weaken the position.
That's
we can't, an argument like that is never going to get us anyplace. So
one wants the intellectual honesty to recognize those things which tend to diminish one's own, look as though they're going to diminish one's own position.
Here's the second thing he says that we ought to try to agree on. So he says that all should support better sex education, try to reduce poverty, which causes a lot of the problems, support practical alternatives to abortion. And again, here's where the pro-choice people could get after some of the pro-life people and saying, well, you talk about this, but where are you in trying to deal with the problem in other ways? Where are you in getting alternatives? And I think it's Brian Hare who says that there is a tremendous moral responsibility that's taken up by any pro-life people. That is, responsibility to say, how are we going to make these alternatives viable? What are we going to do about making life easier for unmarried pregnant women? What are we going to do about the children brought into the world? And I think that really is. I mean, there is a terrible moral responsibility taken on if we're going to adopt that position.
Oh, that's right. And part of the irony of that, I think, is that abortion becomes formally recognized and legal in this country, the most prosperous nation that the world has ever known, at the time of nearly our greatest prosperity. Should be the time when all of a sudden we say we can't afford children, unwanted children, with the word unwanted in quotes. And there's a real irony to that. We're just not doing the kind of address to these problems that lead people to seek abortions that we could and should do. And I think that it is very clearly incumbent on the pro-life people to take a far more forceful position than many of them seem to have taken.
This comes down to a very personal level, doesn't it, Bob? I mean, I know in dealing with young women who are faced with that decision that they have to be able to see that there's a viable alternative.
By all means.
They have to see it's got to be live. It's got to be possible. You can't be an abstract thing like, well, yeah, you could bring the baby to term and then adopt the baby out. It's got to have a note of possibility about it. They've got to see how they could fit yet into their community, how they would be accepted in their family, how the church would treat them during this time. Unmarried pregnant woman, would the church be kind to them and have a place for them?
And not
so
just the
they
church,
have to be able
but
to see that. Well, not just the church, society,
but society
as a
at
whole,
large.
yeah.
I mean, it has to be a context in which people have
the point I was
a
trying to
profound
make
sympathy.
is it would have to be the real life communities where you live,
That's
at
right.
work, in your family, in your church, that where you could see yourself actually living this out and not being the object of scorn or being somehow totally ostracized by your friends or communities and so on.
Yeah, one may very well have thoughtlessly gotten pregnant in circumstances where she should not have done so by moral standards, let us say. But the pregnancy, the fact of the pregnancy, is described by many people as being one of the great, profoundly creative experiences of life, and it should be a time of great challenge and great happiness in the sense of fulfillment. And to rob the pregnant young woman of that is, I think, one of the great tragedies of this whole social context in which we regard the business.
So what we ought to be able to do is get some sense of agreement on this, that there are large social context here that we have to be worried about, and a lot of it has to do with poverty, and we know that. I mean, that's a factor in the whole thing.
But a large part of that context, too, is the responsibility of the church to develop in the minds and hearts of people. It's the way you speak of the church, and as an institution, I think that we have certainly the responsibility to be concerned about the development of resources to help people meet this challenge. But by the same token, the church wouldn't have to be going around making the argument against Roe versus Wade if the Christian churches generally had been more successful in inculcating a sense of the sanctity of life.
Yeah, general sense of
Yes.
the uniqueness of an individual, that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and that all life, and I mean, I think that becomes the most important way, life at all stages of its development. That's the idea, I think, that really has to be brought forward here.
Yes.
And that includes the elderly, that includes the handicapped, and so on.
Oh, sure, you think of the retired people who, in the context of our thinking today, feel useless. They've been put on a shelf because they're no longer productive, as though the value of the human person were a factor of one's productivity.
Right. That's a terrible thing in our society, no doubt about it.
Yes.
Well, Bob, we've been talking here about the Webster decision of the Supreme Court, which has opened the door to a new debate. One of the things we see as a result of the Webster decision is that people are going to be taking this to the state legislatures. There's going to be a debate going on in each of the 50 states, and there's going to be election questions at hand and so on, and are people pro-life or pro-choice? And what we're hoping is that it's going to lead not just to fireworks, but to some enlightened debate, so that people can begin to talk about this. And if we're going to talk about it effectively, we need to avoid slogans like thinking of abortion simply as murder, or a woman has a right to her own body. And we're going to have to identify some of these areas of agreement, like taking care of the social context. It's a fascinating question that's going to be with us a long time.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talked with Father Robert Kirchner, a priest from St. Clement's Parish in Toledo, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was the abortion debate, avoiding slogans. If you have any comments on this week's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.